Security guard laughs at Mark Zuckerberg's hoodie at conference. Doesn't know he owns the building. The San Francisco morning was colder than usual, with a thick fog rolling in from the bay that made the towering glass buildings look like they were floating in the clouds. It was barely 7 a.m., and the streets were starting to fill with the usual mix of tech workers and business people, all hurrying to their morning meetings with coffee cups in hand. Mark Zuckerberg stepped out of his Tesla, parked a few blocks away from the conference center. He'd chosen to drive himself today, wanting to keep a low profile for his surprise inspection of Meta's newest property acquisition. Adjusting his gray hoodie, the same one he'd worn countless times before, he grabbed his worn backpack from the passenger seat. Another beautiful day to blend in, he thought, smiling to himself. Even after all these years, he preferred these moments of anonymity. The hoodie wasn't just comfortable. It was a reminder of where he started, back in his Harvard dorm room. The sidewalks were filling up with people in crisp suits and designer outfits, all headed to the same massive glass building, the San Francisco Tech Center, recently acquired by Meta for their expanding West Coast operations. Mark walked among them, just another face in the crowd. A few people glanced at him, doing double takes, but in the early morning rush, most were too focused on their phones or coffee to notice. Near the entrance, a group of executives in perfectly tailored suits were huddled together, discussing what sounded like quarterly projections. Mark overheard snippets of their conversation as he approached the main doors. The new owner's supposed to do an inspection soon, one of them said, nervously adjusting his tie. I heard it's next week, another replied, checking his Rolex. Everything needs to be perfect for Zuckerberg. Mark suppressed a smile as he walked past them. If they only knew. The lobby of the tech center was impressive. All marble floors, chrome fixtures, and soaring ceilings. A massive digital display covered one wall, showing various tech company logos and stock prices. Meta's logo prominently featured in the center dot at the security desk. Two guards were stationed. The older one was busy checking IDs and handling the morning rush, but the younger one, tall, muscular, with a crew cut and a name tag that read Mike, was scrutinizing everyone who walked through with an air of self-importance. As Mark approached, Mike straightened up, his eyes narrowing at the gray hoodie and jeans. Good morning, Mark said quietly, reaching for his ID. Hey you, stop right there. Mike's voice boomed across the lobby, causing several people to turn and stare. He stepped out from behind the desk, blocking Mark's path. Is there a problem? Mark asked, maintaining his calm demeanor. Mike looked him up and down with undisguised contempt. Yeah, there's a problem. This is a private tech conference, not some college hangout. Where do you think you're going? I'm here for the conference, Mark explained patiently. I can show you in that, Mike interrupted, gesturing at Mark's hoodie with a sneer. This is a billion-dollar tech conference, buddy, not a homeless shelter. His voice was deliberately loud, drawing more attention. People were starting to gather, watching the scene unfold. Some had already pulled out their phones, sensing drama in the making. Listen, Mark tried again. I'm Mark Zuckerberg. If you just let me show you my ID, Mike burst out laughing, a harsh, mocking sound that echoed through the lobby. Oh, that's rich, and I'm Jeff Bezos. He turned to his colleague at the desk. Hey, Jim, this guy says he's Zuckerberg. Jim, the older guard, barely looked up from his computer. Handle it, Mike. I'm busy with the check-ins. A small crowd had formed now, with people whispering and recording. Some looked uncomfortable, others amused. A young intern in the back seemed to recognize Mark, her eyes widening as she tugged on her colleague's sleeve. Look, Mark said, his voice still steady but firmer now. I understand you're doing your job, but no, you look. Mike cut him off, stepping closer, using his height to intimidate. The real Mark Zuckerberg wouldn't show up looking like some college dropout who rolled out of bed. You think we don't deal with pranks like this all the time? A woman in a business suit spoke up from the crowd. Maybe we should stay out of this, Mum. Mike snapped, not taking his eyes off Mark. I deal with troublemakers like this every day. They think they can just walk in here, claim to be someone important. Mark stood his ground, but his expression hardened slightly. Years of dealing with prejudice and preconceptions had taught him patience. But this was getting out of hand. If you could just check my ID. He tried one more time, reaching for his wallet. Mike's face reddened. Oh, what's that? Got a fake ID to go with your little story? Listen, buddy. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a threatening whisper. I've worked security for 10 years. You think you're the first guy to try something like this? The crowd had grown larger. Executives, developers, and staff members were all watching now, many recording the confrontation on their phones. The intern who had recognized Mark was frantically typing on her phone, likely messaging someone about the situation. This is your last warning, Mike announced, clearly enjoying his moment of authority. Get out of here before I have to throw you out, and trust me. He smirked, flexing his shoulders. You don't want that kind of embarrassment. Mark took a deep breath. He could end this with one phone call, but something held him back. This moment, as uncomfortable as it was proving exactly why he'd wanted to make this surprise visit. The embarrassment, Mark said quietly, isn't mine to worry about. Mike's face twisted with anger. That's it. He reached for his radio. Jim, call backup. This guy needs to be. And that's when everything changed. The elevator doors opened and Lisa Chen, the building manager, rushed out, her heels clicking rapidly against the marble floor. One look at the scene, the crowd, the phones recording, Mike towering over a man in a gray hoodie, and her face went pale as she recognized who was being harassed. The next few seconds would become one of the most viral moments in tech history. But right now, it was just a moment of pure, unscripted human drama in a San Francisco lobby on a foggy morning. The story of how a security guard humiliated one of the world's richest men because of a hoodie was about to explode across the internet. But more importantly, it was about to teach everyone, present a lesson about judgment, appearance, and the true meaning of success. Mike was still reaching for his radio, still confident in his authority, still completely unaware that his entire world was about to turn upside down. In just a few seconds, he would learn the hardest lesson of his career, that greatness doesn't always wear a suit. And sometimes, the most powerful people are the ones who don't feel the need to prove it. The lobby of the San Francisco Tech Center fell silent, holding its collective breath, waiting for what would happen next. It was 7:43 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, and everything was about to change. Lisa Chen's heels echoed through the now silent lobby as she rushed toward the scene. Her usually composed face twisted with horror. Oh my God, Mr. Zuckerberg, she called out, her voice trembling. I am so sorry about this. Mike's head snapped toward Lisa, then back to Mark, his face frozen in a mix of confusion and dawning terror. The radio in his hand slipped and clattered to the floor. Did she just say? Mike stammered, his authoritative demeanor crumbling. Yes, Mike, Lisa said sharply, her professional demeanor barely masking her fury. This is Mark Zuckerberg, the owner of this building, the founder of Meta, the person whose name is literally on your paycheck. The crowd's whispers grew louder. Phone cameras were still rolling, capturing every excruciating second of Mike's realization. But he's wearing a hoodie. Mike's voice had shrunk to a whisper, his face draining of color. A hoodie that probably costs more than your monthly salary. Someone in the crowd muttered, drawing a few nervous laughs. Mark raised his hand, slightly, silencing the murmurs. The simple gesture demonstrated more authority than all of Mike's previous posturing. The hoodie, Mark said calmly, looking directly at Mike, is exactly the point. A young programmer in the crowd nodded vigorously. That's his thing. Everyone knows Zuckerberg wears hoodies. It's like his trademark. Mike's legs seemed to wobble. He grabbed the security desk for support, looking like he might be sick. Mr. Zuckerberg, you didn't what? Mark asked, his voice level but intense. Didn't recognize me? Or didn't think someone in a hoodie could be worth respecting? Jim, the older security guard who had ignored the whole situation, finally looked up from his computer. His jaw dropped. Oh, Christ, he muttered, quickly standing and removing his cap. Lisa stepped forward, trying to take control of the situation. Mr. Zuckerberg, please let me escort you to the executive elevator. We can deal with this incident appropriately. But Mark didn't move. He stood there, hands in his hoodie pockets, looking at Mike with an unreadable expression. "You know what's interesting?" Mark said, addressing not just Mike but the entire lobby. "When I walked in here, I was just another person in a hoodie. No one held the door for me. No one smiled or said good morning. A few people even moved their bags away when I got close, like they thought I might steal something." The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Several people looked down at their phones, suddenly very interested in their screens. "And that's exactly why I came early today," Mark continued. "I wanted to see this building, my building, as it really is. Not when it's prepared for a VIP visit, not when everyone's on their best behavior, but on a normal Tuesday morning." Mike looked like he wanted the floor to swallow him whole. "Sir, I was just following protocol." "Protocol?" Mark raised an eyebrow. "Is it protocol to mock people, to threaten them, to judge them based on their clothes?" Lisa tried again. "Mr. Zuckerberg, we have a full investigation and disciplinary process for situations like this. Do you?" Mark turned to her. "How many other people has Mike treated this way? People without my name or resources, people who couldn't fight back." The silence in the lobby was deafening. Even the phones had stopped recording, their owners too, engrossed in the drama unfolding before them. A janitor who had been quietly mopping in the corner spoke up, his voice soft but clear. "He does it all the time, sir, to delivery people, to students, to anyone he thinks isn't important enough." Mike's head snapped toward the janitor, but for the first time that morning, he had nothing to say. Mark nodded slowly, taking in this information. "Thank you for your honesty," he said to the janitor. Then, turning back to Mike, "We need to talk. Are you going to fire me?" Mike's voice cracked. The crowd held its breath, waiting for Mark's response. This was the moment they expected. The powerful billionaire putting the arrogant security guard in his place. But Mark Zuckerberg had built his career on defying expectations. "No, Mike," he said finally, "I'm not going to fire you, but we are going to have a conversation that I think both of us need to have. Lisa," he turned to the building manager, "is the conference room on the 3rd floor available?" Lisa blinked in surprise. "Yes, sir, of course." "Good. Mike, follow me. And bring your radio. You might need it later." As Mark walked toward the elevator, the crowd parted like the Red Sea. Mike, looking shell-shocked, followed behind him, his earlier swagger replaced by the shuffling steps of a man walking to his own execution. Just before the elevator doors closed, Mark turned to address the lobby one last time. "By the way, the conference doesn't start until 9. Anyone sharing videos of what just happened before then might want to consider how it feels to be judged unfairly by millions of strangers." On the internet, the doors closed with a soft ding, leaving behind a lobby full of people frantically deleting videos from their phones. The first chapter of this story was over, but its impact was just beginning. In the coming hours, days, and weeks, what happened next would change not just Mike's life, but the culture of Silicon Valley itself. The elevator ride to the 3rd floor was the longest 90 seconds of Mike Thompson's life. He stood in the corner, trying to make himself as small as possible. No easy feat for a 6'2" former college football player. Mark Zuckerberg stood calmly in the center, hands still in his hoodie pockets, looking at the floor numbers as they lit up one by one. The only sound was the soft hum of the elevator and Mike's ragged breathing. "Mr. Zuckerberg," Mike started. Mark raised a hand slightly. "Not yet." When the doors opened, they revealed a sleek hallway lined with glass-walled conference rooms. Mark walked to the largest one at the end, gesturing for Mike to enter first. The room was impressive, a massive table of polished wood, floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of San Francisco, and state-of-the-art presentation screens on every wall. Under different circumstances, Mike might have whistled in appreciation. Right now, he just felt sick. "Sit down," Mark said, pointing to a chair, not at the far end of the table where subordinates usually sat, but right next to the head chair. This somehow made Mike even more nervous. As they sat, Mike's radio crackled to life. "Mike, you there? What's happening?" Jim's worried voice came through. Mark nodded at the radio. "You should answer that." With trembling hands, Mike raised the radio to his lips. I'm in a meeting with Mr. Zuckerberg. Everything's fine. Hold all calls." There was a long pause before Jim responded. 10 to 4, he said finally, his voice full of disbelief. Mark pressed a button on the table, and the glass walls frosted over, giving them privacy. He then pulled out his phone, glanced at it briefly, and set it face down on the table. "You have kids?" "Mike," the question caught Mike off guard. "Yes, sir. 2. Emma's 7, and Tommy's 5. "Do they know what you do for a living?" Mike swallowed hard. "They think I'm a superhero," he said quietly. "They call me Security Man, their own version of Superman. They think I protect people." Mark nodded slowly. "And do you protect people?" "I try to, sir. I take my job seriously. Maybe too seriously sometimes." "Tell me about this morning, Mike. Walk me through what happened, from your perspective." Mike shifted uncomfortably in his chair. I saw someone who didn't fit the profile of our usual visitors. The dress code for the conference clearly states business attire, and you decided to handle it by publicly humiliating them." "No, I didn't mean to. I was just doing my job." Mark leaned forward slightly. "Were you? Was mockery in your training manual? Was threatening physical violence part of your job description?" Mike's face flushed with shame. "No, sir." "Then why?" The question hung in the air. Mike stared at his hands, trying to find the right words. "Because," he started, then stopped. "Because I could," he finally admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "Because it made me feel important. Because in this building full of millionaires and geniuses, being tough on people who don't fit in was the only power I had." To Mike's surprise, Mark nodded understanding. "I know something about not fitting in, sir. When I started Facebook, before it was Meta, I was just a college kid in a hoodie. Do you know how many times I was kicked out of meetings? How many security guards just like you decided I wasn't worth respecting?" Mike looked up, meeting Mark's eyes for the first time. "But you're Mark Zuckerberg." "I wasn't always. Once I was just a guy in a hoodie with an idea. The difference is, I had the resources and support to push through those moments of humiliation. Not everyone does." The weight of those words hit Mike hard. He thought about all the people he'd turned away, mocked, or intimidated over the years. How many of them might have had the next big idea? "The janitor downstairs," Mark continued. "He said you do this all the time. Is he right?" Mike wanted to deny it, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he found himself talking about things he'd never admitted out loud. "My father was a janitor," he said suddenly. "Worked in buildings like this his whole life. People treated him like he was invisible. When I got this job, I promised myself I'd be different, better. But instead," he trailed off, realization dawning on his face. "Instead, I became exactly what I hated. I became the people who looked down on my dad." Mark was quiet for a moment, letting the admission sink in. Then he reached into his hoodie pocket and pulled out his wallet. From it, he extracted a worn photograph. "Know what this is?" Mike leaned forward to look. The photo showed a much younger Mark Zuckerberg, wearing a hoodie that looked almost identical to the one he wore now, sitting in what looked like a college dorm room. "This was taken the night we launched Facebook. I keep it to remind me of something important. Success doesn't change who you are. It just reveals it." Mike stared at the photo, then at Mark, then down at his own security uniform. "I've revealed myself to be a bully, haven't I?" "Yes," Mark said simply. "But that's not the end of the story." Before Mike could respond, there was a knock at the door. Lisa Chen entered, looking anxious. "Mr. Zuckerberg, I have the incident report forms ready, and HR is standing by for your decision regarding Mr. Thompson's employment status." Mike's heart sank. Despite Mark's earlier words, he was sure this was it, the moment he'd lose everything. But Mark surprised them both. "Lisa, what's your honest opinion of Mike as a security guard?" "Apart from this morning," Lisa hesitated, "he's actually one of our best, sir. His attention to detail is excellent. He's never late. And he's caught several potential security breaches. Last month, he stopped an industrial espionage attempt during a tech convention." "Really?" Mark turned to Mike. "Tell me about that." For the next few minutes, Mike explained how he'd noticed suspicious behavior from a group of visitors. investigated discreetly, and prevented proprietary technology from being stolen. As he talked about the proper way to handle security, his voice grew more confident, more professional. "That's the real you," Mark said when he finished. "The one who protects people, not bullies them. The one your kids think is a superhero." Mike felt tears welling up in his eyes. "I'm sorry, Mr. Zuckerberg. What I did downstairs. There's no excuse." "No, there isn't," Mark agreed. "But there can be change, Lisa. Cancel those HR forms." "I have a different idea." Lisa looked uncertain. "Sir, there are protocols for incidents like this. Sometimes protocols need to change." Mark said, standing up. "Mike, here's what's going to happen. You're going to keep your job." Mike's relief was palpable, but Mark wasn't finished. "But," he continued, "you're going to do something more important than just security. You're going to help me change the culture of this building, of all our buildings." "I don't understand," Mike said. "You're going to create a training program, something that teaches security staff about prejudice, about judgment, about the difference between real security and power trips. You're going to share your story, both the mistake and the lesson." Mike sat up straighter. "You want me to teach others? Who better than someone who's learned the hard way? But first," Mark pulled out his phone and opened his calendar. "You and I are going to have weekly meetings for the next month. We'll develop this program together." Lisa's jaw dropped. "Sir, your schedule is already incredibly full. Make room," Mark said firmly. "This is important. Mike, your first assignment is to go downstairs and apologize to that janitor. Not because I'm telling you to, but because you understand why. You need to." Mike nodded, standing up. His legs were steadier now. His posture different, not the fake authority of before, but something more genuine. "Mr. Zuckerberg," he said, "why are you giving me this chance?" Mark adjusted his hoodie. "Because 10 years ago, someone gave me a chance when I was just a kid in a hoodie with a crazy idea. Sometimes that's all people need." As Mike reached for the door, Mark added one more thing. "Oh, and Mike, bring your kids to the office someday. I'd like to meet Security Man's biggest fans." For the first time that morning, Mike smiled, a real smile, not the smirk he'd worn earlier. "They won't believe their dad knows Mark Zuckerberg." "Tell them the story," Mark suggested. "The whole story. Sometimes the best superhero lessons come from learning how not to be a villain." As Mike left the conference room, Lisa turned to Mark. "Sir, are you sure about this? The press will have a field day if this gets out." Mark picked up his phone, which had been buzzing quietly throughout their conversation. "Actually, I'm counting on it. But not yet. First, let's see if Mike really understands the lesson." Down in the lobby, the regular morning rush had resumed. But something was different. Mike walked over to Ramon, the janitor who had spoken up earlier. "Excuse me," he said, his voice humble. "I owe you an apology. Actually, I owe you about 100 apologies." Ramon looked surprised, leaning on his mop. "You're not mad I spoke up?" "No," Mike said. "I'm grateful. You helped me see something I needed to see." He held out his hand. "I'm Mike Thompson, and I'd like to start over, if that's okay." As they shook hands, neither man noticed Mark watching from the security camera feed in his phone. A small smile on his face. The second chapter was ending, but the real changes were just beginning. In the weeks to come, the story of the security guard who judged Mark Zuckerberg would become a viral sensation, but not for the reasons anyone expected. Because sometimes, the biggest revelations come not from being right, but from admitting when you're wrong. And sometimes, the most powerful lessons come wearing a hoodie, asterisk back in the lobby. The morning buzz had shifted into something different. The early crowd of tech executives and employees had thinned out, but a new kind of tension filled the air. Whispers followed Mike as he walked from the elevator to his security post. "That's him, the guy who tried to throw out Zuckerberg. Can't believe he still has his job." "Did you see the video?" my friend in HR said. Jim looked up nervously as Mike approached the security desk. "Mike, Aisha, is everything okay?" Mike took a deep breath, straightening his uniform. "No, Jim, everything's not okay. But it's going to be." He picked up his radio, the same one he'd dropped earlier in his shock, and clipped it back to his belt. His hands weren't shaking anymore, but his movements were deliberate, like someone relearning how to do a familiar task. "Listen up," he said to Jim and the other morning shift guards who had gathered around. "I messed up, big time, and I need to tell you all something." A small crowd started forming: security staff, receptionists, and some curious onlookers who hadn't witnessed the earlier incident but had heard about it through the building's rapid gossip network. "For years," Mike started, his voice stronger. "Now, I've been doing this job wrong. I thought being security meant showing authority, making people feel small when they didn't fit what I thought was right. I was wrong." One of the younger guards, Kevin, spoke up. "But Mike, you always taught us to be tough, to show we're in charge, and that was my mistake." Mike cut him off. "Being tough isn't about intimidation. It's about protection. Real protection." Lisa Chen had returned to the lobby and stood at the edges of the group, watching with interest as Mike continued. "Mr. Zuckerberg just taught me something up there." He gestured toward the conference room. "He could have fired me, should have fired me. Instead, he showed me what real leadership looks like." "What happened up there?" someone asked. Mike looked around at his colleagues, at the people he'd worked with for years, at the faces that had watched him bully and intimidate countless visitors. "He asked me about my kids," Mike said, his voice softening. "Asked me if they know what I do for a living. They think I'm a superhero, you know? Security man, they call me." He laughed, but it was a different laugh from his earlier mockery. This one was filled with self-awareness. "And today, I realized I've been the villain in my own story." Ramon, who was still nearby with his mop, nodded slowly. Mike caught his eye and walked over to him. "Ramon here. He's worked in this building longer than any of us. He sees everything." And when Mr. Zuckerberg asked about my behavior, Ramon was the only one brave enough to tell the truth. Ramon shifted uncomfortably under the sudden attention, but Mike continued. "How many times have I walked past you, Ramon, without even saying good morning? How many times have I treated you like you were invisible?" "Many times," Ramon said quietly. "Many times with many guards." Mike turned back to his security team. "That changes today. Mr. Zuckerberg has given us, a chance to do better. He wants us to create a new kind of security training, one that's about respect, not power trips." "But what about protocol?" Kevin asked. "The dress code, the rules." "The protocols stay," Mike explained, "but how we enforce them changes. You can be firm without being cruel. You can be professional without being a bully." Lisa stepped forward then. "Mr. Zuckerberg has authorized a complete overhaul of our security training program. Mike will be leading it, with direct input from executive leadership." The surprise on everyone's faces matched what Mike had felt upstairs. A few people started whispering again, but this time the tone was different, more curious than judgmental. "First thing tomorrow morning," Mike announced, "we're having a team meeting. All security staff, all shifts. We're going to talk about what happened today, and we're going to start changing how we do things." He turned to Ramon again. "And you're invited to. We need to hear your perspective, if you're willing to share it." Ramon smiled slightly. "I'll be there. Someone needs to keep security man honest." "Yes." The tension in the lobby broke as people chuckled. Even Jim cracked a smile. Just then, the main doors opened, and a young woman in ripped jeans and a paint-stained t-shirt walked in, carrying what looked like art supplies. Mike saw Kevin start to step forward with that familiar look of judgment on his face. "I got this," Mike said, walking over to the woman. "Good morning," he said warmly. "Welcome to the San Francisco Tech Center. How can I help you today?" The woman looked surprised at the greeting. "I'm here for the digital art conference. I know I'm early, but I wanted to set up my installation, of course," Mike said, checking her credentials with professional courtesy. "Let me help you find the right room, and maybe tell you a story about judging books by their covers while we walk." As Mike escorted the artist toward the elevators, he caught a glimpse of himself in the polished walls. The reflection showed the same uniform, the same badge, the same person, but somehow everything was different. High above in his temporary office, Mark Zuckerberg watched the security feed with satisfaction. He pulled out his phone and sent a quick message to his team. "Change of plans. The press release about the building acquisition goes out today. and add something about our new approach to corporate security culture. I think we just found our next viral moment. The second chapter was drawing to a close, but its effects were rippling outward. In the coming weeks, the story of what happened in that lobby would spread far beyond the glass walls of the San Francisco Tech Center. But first, there were more immediate changes to be made, starting with a security guard who learned that sometimes the biggest strength comes from admitting your biggest mistakes. 1 month after the infamous Hoodie incident, the San Francisco Tech Center's lobby had a different energy. The marble floors still gleamed. The digital displays still flickered with stock prices, but something fundamental had changed. Mike Thompson stood at his usual post, but his posture was different. Alert, but not intimidating. Professional, but approachable. A small pin on his uniform caught the morning light. Respect first, judge never. Morning, Ramon. He called out to the janitor pushing his cart through the lobby. Good morning, security man. Ramon replied with a grin, using the nickname that had somehow spread throughout the building. That the past month had been a whirlwind of changes. After his first meeting with Mark Zuckerberg, Mike had thrown himself into transforming the security culture, but it hadn't been easy. Hey, Mike. Kevin approached the security desk, looking troubled. Got a situation at the south entrance. There's a guy in sweats and a beanie who says he's here for the coding boot camp. Mike raised an eyebrow. And well, I remembered what you said about not judging by appearance, but Kevin lowered his voice. He seems really out of place. Let's handle this together, Mike said, heading toward the south entrance. Think of it as a teaching moment. At the entrance, a young man in gray sweats and a worn beanie stood shifting nervously. From foot to foot, dark circles under his eyes suggested he hadn't slept much. Good morning, Mike greeted him warmly. I understand you're here for the coding boot camp. Yeah, the man said, his voice tight with anxiety. Look, I know I don't look the part, but I've been coding for 36 straight hours to finish the pre-work, and I didn't have time to change. And Mike held up a hand. Sir, all we need is to see your registration and ID, your dedication to finishing the pre-work. That's exactly what this place is about. The man's shoulders relaxed slightly as he pulled out his phone to show his registration. Email, I'm Mike Thompson. By the way, Mike said as he verified the credentials. And trust me, you're not the first person to show up here looking like they just finished a coding marathon. Thanks, the man said, managing a small smile. I'm Tom. I actually heard about this place from a viral video. Something about Mark Zuckerberg and a security guard. Mike and Kevin exchanged glances. Yeah, Mike said, handing back Tom's phone. I know that story pretty well. In fact, he paused, then made a decision. That security guard was me. Tom's eyes widened. No way. But you're so nice. I wasn't. Always, Mike admitted. Want to hear the full story while I walk you to the boot camp room? As they walked, Mike shared his experience, watching Tom's expression shift from surprise to understanding. So that's why you didn't give me a hard time about the sweats? Tom asked. That's part of it. But mainly it's because we learned that innovation doesn't wear a uniform. Some of the biggest breakthroughs in this building have come from people who don't fit the traditional mold. They reached the boot camp room, where other participants were setting up their laptops. Some wore business casual, others wore hoodies and jeans. Thanks, Mike, Tom said. You know, I was really nervous about coming here. Thought I wouldn't fit in. You belong here as much as anyone, Mike assured him. Just focus on your code, not your clothes. Back at the security desk, Kevin was shaking his head. A month ago, we would have given that guy such a hard time. A month ago, we were part of the problem. Mike replied. Now we're part of the solution. The morning continued, with its usual flow of people. But each interaction was an opportunity to implement the new approach. Mike watched his team handle various situations, occasionally stepping in to guide or support. Around noon, Lisa Chen approached the security desk. Mike, got a minute? Mr. Zuckerberg wants an update on the training program. Mike checked his watch. The weekly meeting, that's not until tomorrow. No, Lisa said with a slight smile. He's here now, in the lobby. Sure enough, Mark Zuckerberg was walking through the main entrance, wearing his signature hoodie. This time, the Though no one tried to stop him, Mark greeted him with a nod. "Walk with me?" They headed toward the elevator, passing groups of employees who tried and failed to pretend they weren't staring. "I've been watching the security feeds," Mark said as they entered the elevator. "Saw how you handled that boot camp participant this morning." Mike felt a flutter of nervousness. "Was that okay?" I told him about what happened. "That's exactly why I'm here," Mark said. "Your story, our story. It's having an impact, not just here, but across the tech industry." The elevator opened on the 3rd floor, and they walked to the now familiar conference room. The video never leaked, Mike noted as they sat down. "No," Mark agreed, "because people understood something more important than viral content. They understood change." He pulled out his tablet and brought up some statistics. "Security complaints are down 87% since we implemented your training program. Employee satisfaction is up. And here's the interesting part. We're seeing more diverse candidates applying for both tech and non-tech positions." Really? People are hearing about how we handled the Hoodie incident. Not about the mistake, but about the change that came after. Other companies are starting to ask about our security protocols. Mike sat straighter. "I've been working on expanding the training materials. Ramon, you remember Ramon, the janitor? He's been helping me understand things from a different perspective. Tell me about it," Mark said, settling in to listen. For the next hour, Mike outlined his plans for the future of the program. He talked about incorporating different viewpoints, about teaching security staff to recognize their biases, about maintaining safety without sacrificing dignity. "There's something else," Mike said finally. "I've been thinking about my kids, about what I want them to learn from all this." "Go on." "They still call me security man, but now it means something different. I'm teaching them that a real superhero's strength isn't in making people feel small. It's in helping them feel big enough to achieve their dreams." Mark nodded slowly. "You know, Mike, when I decided not to fire you that day, some people thought I was making a mistake. They said I was being too soft, that I needed to make an example of you. Why didn't you? Because firing you would have been easy. Changing the culture, that's the hard part. And sometimes the best way to change a culture is to change one person's perspective and let them change others." Their conversation was interrupted by Mike's radio crackling to life. "Mike, it was Kevin. We've got a situation in the lobby. There's a group here for the venture capital meeting, but their leader, well, he's dressed kind of unusual." Mike looked at Mark, who gestured for him to answer. "Define unusual." "Kevin, he's wearing, well, pajama pants and a startup t-shirt. Says he just got off a red-eye flight and came straight here. He's got the right credentials, but what's the startup on his shirt?" Mark asked quietly. Mike repeated the question into his radio. Something called Dreamspace VR, Kevin replied. Mark smiled. "That would be Jamie Chen. His company just developed a breakthrough in virtual reality technology. We're thinking of acquiring them." Mike pressed his radio button. "Kevin, give Mr. Chen and his team a warm welcome. Offer them coffee. They've had a long flight. And Kevin, remember our new motto, respect first. Judge never," Kevin replied. "Got it, boss." As they headed back to the lobby, Mark made one final comment. "You know, Mike, I never actually thanked you." "Thanked me? For what?" "For being the perfect example of what needed to change. Sometimes we need to see the worst in ourselves to bring out the best." The elevator doors opened to reveal Jamie Chen and his team being served coffee by a very attentive Kevin. Chen's pajama pants had cartoon rockets on them. Mike smiled. A month ago, this scene would have been unthinkable. Now it was just another day at the San Francisco Tech Center, where innovation wore many different outfits, and respect came standard with every interaction. The 3rd chapter was ending, but its lessons would continue to ripple outward, because sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest adjustments, like learning to see beyond a hoodie, or finding the courage to admit when you're wrong. Later that afternoon, Mike sat in the security office, reviewing the day's reports. His desk, once sparse and intimidating, now held family photos and a handmade security man card from his kids. A stack of training manuals, the ones he'd helped develop, sat in the corner. His phone buzzed with a text from his wife. "Sarah, your story made it to Emma's school. Her teacher used it in a lesson about not judging others. Our daughter is so proud of her daddy, Mike smiled, remembering how he dreaded telling his family about the incident. Instead of shame, they'd shown him what true support looked like. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. It was Ramon. Mike, got a minute? Something interesting just happened. Comin', Ramon. What's up? Ramon sat down, still in his maintenance uniform. Remember that young man from the coding boot camp this morning, Tom? Yeah, the one in sweats who'd been coding all night. What about him? Well, during lunch break, he was sitting in the cafeteria, looking overwhelmed. I was cleaning nearby and heard him talking to himself about giving up, saying he didn't belong here. Mike leaned forward. What did you do? I told him your story, the full version, about how you went from being the guy who judged people to the guy who helps them believe in themselves. You did. Ramon nodded. He asked me if it was really true. I showed him the viral posts about it, the ones that focus on the change, not the mistake. You should have seen his face, Mike. It was like watching someone stand taller. Before Mike could respond, his radio crackled. Mike, it was Kevin again. Remember that venture capitalist in pajamas from this morning? He's back at the front desk. Says he wants to talk to you specifically. Mike exchanged glances with Ramon. On my way. In the lobby, Jamie Chen was waiting, still in his rocket-covered pajama pants, but now looking more awake after several cups of coffee. Mr. Chen, how can I help you, please? Call me Jamie, he said with a tired smile. I wanted to thank you personally. Your team's welcome this morning. It meant a lot. Just doing our job. Sir, no. Jamie shook his head. You did more than that. You made us feel welcome when we were at our most vulnerable. Do you know how rare that is in Silicon Valley? Mike noticed other security guards listening nearby, including some from the afternoon shift who were just arriving. Jamie continued, I've been kicked out of more buildings than I can count. Been told I don't look professional enough to be a CEO. Even today, after all our success, I still get judged by my appearance. Things are changing. Mike said, slowly, but they are. Because of people like you, Jamie replied. I heard about what happened here with Mark Zuckerberg. How you turned a moment of prejudice into a movement for change. Mike felt his face flush. I'm not proud of who I was that day, but you should be proud of who you became because of it. Jamie said, listen, I have a proposition for you. He explained that his company, Dreamspace VR, was developing virtual reality training programs for corporate environments. We want to create a module about unconscious bias and security protocols. Would you be interested in consulting with us? Sharing your story and the training program you've developed here? Mike was stunned. I'd need to check with Mr. Zuckerberg. And Miss Chen already did. Jamie grinned. Mark thinks it's a great idea. Says it aligns perfectly with Meta's new corporate culture initiatives. As they discussed the details, Mike noticed Tom from the coding bootcamp watching from across the lobby. The young man gave him a thumbs up. Later, after Jamie left, Mike gathered his security team for their end-of-day briefing. Looking at their faces, some he'd worked with for years, others newly hired under the new protocols, he felt a surge of pride. Something I've learned this past month, he told them. Being security isn't about keeping people out. It's about making sure the right people feel safe coming in. And sometimes, the right people don't look like what we expect. Kevin raised his hand. Like a CEO in pajamas, or a billionaire in a hoodie. Another guard added, or a coder who hasn't slept in 36 hours. Mike nodded. Our job isn't to judge their appearance. Our job is to protect their opportunity to succeed. As the team dispersed, Ramon approached with his mop. You know what the best part is, Mike? Your kids were right all along. What do you mean? You are a superhero. Not because you can intimidate people, but because you learned how to lift them up instead. Mike looked around the lobby, at the diverse crowd of people flowing through the doors, at his security team treating everyone with respect, at the small changes that were adding up to something bigger. The third chapter was drawing to a close, but the story was far from over, because sometimes the greatest power isn't in maintaining authority, but in admitting when you need to change. And sometimes, the best security comes not from keeping people out, but from helping them find their way in **. 6 months after the Hoodie incident, the San Francisco Tech Center was hosting its biggest event of the year, the Meta Innovation Summit. The lobby buzzed with activity as attendees from around the world streamed through the entrance, some in suits, others in hoodies, and everything in between. Mike Thompson stood at his post, watching his security team in action. Each guard wore the now familiar respect first, judge never pin, and more importantly, lived by its meaning. Security man, security man. Mike turned to see his children, Emma and Tommy, running toward him, followed by his wife Sarah. They were dressed up for the special occasion, though Tommy had insisted on wearing his superhero cape over his dress shirt. "Hey, kiddos," Mike scooped them up in a hug, ready for the big day. "Is Mr. Zuckerberg really going to talk about you, Daddy?" Emma asked, her eyes wide with excitement. "That's what they tell me, Princess. But remember, it's not just about me, it's about how everybody deserves respect." Tommy finished proudly, even if they wear funny clothes. Sarah squeezed Mike's arm. "They've been practicing that line all morning." Kevin approached, grinning at the kids. "Boss, they're ready for you in the auditorium." Final sound check before the presentation. Mike nodded. "Sarah, can you take the kids to their seats? I'll see you up there." As he walked toward the auditorium, Mike passed Ramon, who was showing a new janitor around. "Remember," Ramon was saying, "in this building, we're all part of the security team. We see things others don't see. We make sure everyone feels welcome, even the janitors," the new hire asked skeptically. "Especially the janitors," Mike cut in. "Ramon here taught me one of the most important lessons of my career." The main auditorium was packed. Tech leaders, investors, and media filled the seats. On stage, Mark Zuckerberg was doing a microphone check, wearing his signature hoodie. Mark waved him over. "Ready for your big moment?" "Nervous," Mike admitted. "Public speaking isn't exactly in the security guard handbook." "Neither is transforming corporate culture," Mark replied. "But you seem to be pretty good at that." The presentation screens behind them displayed the title, "Redefining Security: How One Moment Changed Meta's Culture." Lisa Chen appeared with a tablet. "5 minutes until we start. The live stream is already getting thousands of viewers." Mike peeked through the curtain. In the front row, he saw his family, Tommy still in his cape, Emma clutching her "My Dad is Security Man" sign. Behind them sat Jamie Chen in a suit this time, Ramon and his family, and Tom from the coding bootcamp, now a full-time employee. "Mr. Zuckerberg," Mike said suddenly, "can I make a last-minute change to my speech?" Mark raised an eyebrow. "What kind of change?" "I want to start with a story. Not about the day I met you, but about the day after. About what really changed." Mark smiled. "The stage is yours, Mike. Just speak from the heart." The lights dimmed, and the audience fell silent. Mark stepped up to the podium. "We're here today to talk about change," he began. "Not the kind that happens in our stock prices or our technology, but the kind that happens in our hearts and minds. 6 months ago, a security guard in this building judged me by my hoodie." Mike took a deep breath, waiting for his cue. Through the curtain, he could see his children beaming with pride. They didn't see a security guard who had made a terrible mistake. They saw their dad, their superhero, who had learned to be better. And maybe that was the biggest change of all. Mark stepped aside from the podium, gesturing for Mike to take the stage. The spotlight felt warm and intimidating, but Mike found strength in the familiar faces in the audience. 6 months ago, Mike began, his voice steady. "I was the kind of security guard who thought power meant making people feel small. I wore this uniform like armor, using it to judge and intimidate. Then one morning, I tried to throw Mark Zuckerberg out of his own building." A ripple of laughter went through the audience. "But that's not the real story," Mike continued. "The real story is about what happened the next day, and the day after that, and every day since then." He gestured to his security team, standing along the walls of the auditorium. "The day after I met Mark, I had to face my team, had to tell them that everything I'd taught them about security was wrong. That was harder than facing Mark himself." In the audience, Kevin nodded, remembering that morning. "I gathered them all in the lobby," Mike recalled. "Some of them expected me to be fired. Others thought it was all a joke, and I told them something. That changed everything. We've been doing this wrong. All of it. We're not here to keep people out. We're here to make sure the right people feel safe coming in. Mike pulled his respect first. Judge never pinned from his uniform. These pins, they're not just words. They're a promise to ourselves, to this building, and to every person who walks through those doors. But the real change, it didn't come from me. He pointed to Ramon in the audience. It came from people like Ramon, our janitor, who had the courage to speak truth to power. From people like Tom, he nodded to the former boot camp participant, who showed us that dedication doesn't wear a suit. From people like Jamie Chen, who taught us that innovation sometimes wears pajamas with rockets on them. Asterisk laughter and applause filled the auditorium. But most importantly, Mike's voice softened as he looked at his children. It came from two kids who never stopped believing their dad could be a real superhero. Even when he was acting like a villain, Tommy stood up in his cape, waving enthusiastically until Sarah gently pulled him back into his seat. Today, we're launching something new, Mike announced, the Respect First Initiative. It's a training program that's already being adopted by companies across Silicon Valley. But it's more than just training. It's a movement. The screens behind him showed statistics, decreased security incidents, increased employee satisfaction, higher diversity in job applications. These numbers tell a story, Mike continued. But the real story is in the moments you don't see. The nervous intern who feels welcomed instead of intimidated. The brilliant programmer who doesn't get judged for their appearance. The next Mark Zuckerberg, wearing a hoodie and carrying a dream, who finds an open door instead of a barrier. Mark returned to the podium, standing beside Mike. 6 months ago, Mark added, "I could have fired Mike. It would have been the easy choice. Instead, we chose the harder path, real change. And today, the San Francisco Tech Center isn't just a building. It's a model for what corporate security can be." The lights came up as Mark and Mike unveiled the new security training program materials. But the presentation wasn't over. "There's one more thing," Mark announced. "Mike, your team has something for you." Kevin and the other guards approached the stage, carrying what looked like a framed document. But when they turned it around, Mike saw it was something else entirely, a comic book cover. "The Adventures of Security Man," Kevin read aloud, written by the security team, illustrated by our own tech artists, and dedicated to the guy who taught us that real strength comes from lifting people up, not pushing them down. Mike took the frame with trembling hands. The artwork showed him in his uniform, but instead of looking intimidating, the character was helping people up steps, opening doors, offering guidance. In the background, a figure in a hoodie gave a thumbs up. "This isn't just my story," Mike said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "This is our story, all of us. Because at the end of the day, security isn't about keeping people out. It's about helping people find their way in." The applause was thunderous. In the front row, Tommy stood on his chair, cape flying, cheering for his dad. Emma held up her sign higher. Sarah wiped tears from her eyes as the event wound down and people began to leave. A young woman approached Mike. She wore a hoodie and carried a laptop covered in coding stickers. "I've got an interview here next week," she said. "I was nervous about how I'd be treated. But after today," she smiled, "thank you for making people like me feel welcome." Mike touched his Respect First pin. "Just remember one thing, you belong here. We all do." Later that evening, as the cleaning crew prepared the building for another day, Mike did one final lobby walkthrough. Ramon was there, mopping the marble floors. "Good speech, security man," Ramon grinned. "Couldn't have done it without you, my friend." Mike paused. "You know, my kids were right all along. Being a superhero isn't about having power. It's about what you do with it." "And what do we do with it?" Ramon asked, though he knew the answer. Mike looked at the lobby, where tomorrow another day would begin, another chance to make a difference. "We open doors," he said simply, "and we keep them open for everyone who dreams big enough to walk through them." The story of the security guard who judged Mark Zuckerberg had become something bigger than one mistake or one lesson. It had become a movement, a change, a promise. Because sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest moments of understanding. And sometimes the best security comes not from keeping people out, but from helping them find where they belong. Asterisk.